Welcome, everybody, to this pre-recorded Christian education series on spiritual practices. And if you remember the very first time, episode number 1, talked about spiritual practices in general and how they can facilitate a closer walk with God. And, spiritual practices are not really well known in the Protestant world, the English-speaking mainline churches. But they are something that more and more Christians and ministers and believers are investigating. These were the ancient spiritual practices in the early church, practiced by monks and nuns from the 6th century about onwards, on an ongoing basis, and yielding wonderful spiritual new avenues for a closer relationship with God. But we've just learned them of late, and discovering how beautiful they are. Well, I'm very pleased to be joined by Botsis, a long-time friend and colleague of mine, and we're going to talk today about the topic of practicing hospitality as a spiritual practice. Now, this is not a personal thing like prayer and fasting and Bible reading and so on. This is a corporate practice or an interpersonal practice. You can't be hospitable just with yourself. You've got to invite somebody else into the room. So that's really the content of our conversation. Rod, if you think back over the years and you think about hospitality, have you experienced it as a spiritual practice rather than just an ordinary thing that happens in everyday life, which it also is, of course?
Let me preface my remarks by saying, in thinking about this chat with one another, I wondered about who has shown me hospitality in a way that has been pleasurable and lovely and easy, but also spiritual. And it may embarrass you, but I can think of 2 people, especially in my life. One would be you, and the other one would be Ian Thompson. I could add to that list in different ways, but somehow both of you have produced a hospitality and have shown a hospitality towards me that has led me to Christ and that has made me think again of being a disciple of Christ and how to apply myself. So I can certainly say that as a way in. Yes, there's a real link between hospitality and spirituality. No doubt about that. Yeah.
So one of the phrases that we are using when we talk about spiritual practices is that spiritual practices is fundamentally about ordinary people in everyday life. And I think one of the reasons we use this is to avoid people getting bogged down by the false notion that you have to have some special sort of training or some special higher knowledge, or there's a very technical way of doing spiritual practices. And that's not necessarily true. Ordinary things in everyday life can be spiritual practices. And the reason we talk about it like that is because we can experience it in gardening, in reading of novels. I know you're a great novel reader. That can be a spiritual practice because it's whatever God can use as a vehicle to make the relationship between yourself and himself closer, or whatever human beings can use to try to walk with him in the cool of the day, or
lovely,
to experience his close and intimate presence. And so I don't want anybody who is watching this program, this pre-recorded Bible study, to think that this is some technical textbook thing that you and I are talking about today. We're talking about something that the early church did without thinking. They shared meals in their homes.
Yes.
They broke bread together, which I think is the precursor to Holy Communion. Before the chalices and the patens and the silverware and tiny glasses, It was a meal, a shared meal. And I know that you know that the Bible is full, or not the Bible, the Bible, but the gospel is full of intimate sharing of food between Jesus and others, where beautiful things happen because it's intimate. I mean, what is it about hospitality that that makes us relax, that brings us into the presence of the other. That I mean, two or three are gathered. I mean, if you add it around a meal, I mean, how much it just speaks of a place where Christ can be present.
You've used two phrases already that I'd like to reflect on. One is this little bit of humor about the silver chalices or whatever. You must know the ancient quotation that in the early church, the people were silver and gold, and they used wooden instruments and earthenware. But the time came when the people became wooden, and the chalices became silver.
Wow. Wow.
Um, and then to be with God in the cool of the day. I mean, that's a fantastic description of being in an hospitable place that I'm allowed just to be. And whatever the cool of the day comes up, it's not the sweat of my brow. It's not punishment. It's not fear. It's literally sitting relaxed, coughing your favorite tipple, whatever that may be, in the most relaxed places. I think clergy have probably much to answer for here in trying to describe what holiness is, and we've made it into something so unworldly rather than just other, and so we've set up these kind of expectations in people that there are certain holy acts or acts that are holier than others. When in fact, the very incarnation tells you that holiness is earthbound. It is here. It is in the very fabric of this world, and so we've got to somehow get back to that absolutely everything can lead us into the presence of God. I've got a little pause in my mind here where people say they don't need to worship with others because they meet God in the garden and they meet God in the hills. There's a little question mark about that because hospitality must include others at whatever level. You're either receiving or you're giving, or hopefully you're doing both. Why a meal? Because it's such a basic function, you know. It's a very hard heart that can eat something in front of someone else who has nothing and not share something, or at least not feel guilty about that. And sure as hell on the receiving end, if I have nothing and I'm watching you eat something, I long to be drawn into that circle where I will be able to receive or be given something. And I think it's so basic that's the genesis of hospitality, to gather together to share.
You make me think of a story I once read. It wasn't a biblical or a theological book at all, not a book about faith. It was basically about hospitality as meal sharing across the world. And there were little stories, short stories. And one was written by a traveler. He'd been traveling across Mongolia. It was like a endurance thing. And but of course in Mongolia, there's not, outside the main capital city, there's not much in the way of hotels or things like that. So he was reliant upon the generosity of others. So he would arrive at a place and sort of just hang around. And then one of the families would come out and would say, would you like to come and eat with us? Would you like to come and stay the night? He and his horse. And the story I remember so well is when he was invited in by just such a family in some rural place, in one of those big sort of tent things. They sort of traveled from place to place, and they were talking. And there was another visitor as well. This visitor had come from this capital city, and the family had not been into civilization, to the capital city, for ages. So they were hanging on the other travelers' every word while he told them stories about the capital city. And then he said to them, there's an interesting thing we have now. It's called a restaurant, a tea room, a coffee shop. And he says what happens is that people come and they can have a meal and they can have a cup of tea or coffee. And the people, the hosts, were horrified because they thought that the very lowest level of hospitality required that if you had nothing to offer, if you had no food, you at least could offer someone a hot cup of tea. And the notion that someone would have to pay for such a thing was sort of it was disgusting to them. And I was so taken aback by that story, that ordinary people, simple, ordinary people, farmers, whatever they were, I don't know, would have such a sense of connection with the stranger through the sharing of the basics, which in their culture was a cup of hot tea, and that it should be commercialized was horrible to them. Yet we've commercialized hospitality, haven't we? We've got hotels, we've got bed and breakfast, we've got fast food. Everything that used to constitute hospitality can be bought.
I mean, I think that's true with absolutely everything. I've been amazed over the length of my life how some people have shown wonderful hospitality by treating me to places and to things that I would never have got to myself. And how others in that very same exercise have made me feel almost humiliated that they really were not sharing their heart with me at all. They were sharing their wealth, but to make me feel the wealth and not the heart. And at the other end of the scale, there are people who have opened their homes, and it's been pretty humble.
Sure.
But the heart has come. The heart has come through. I mean, one gets emotional about these things, but I remember, as you will, as being moderator, traveling to places. I remember going to a town in Limpopo that had water shortages, and there was no water in this little village. They were getting it from trucks nearby. And when I arrived, the host said to me, "Moderator, you can bath tonight if you want to." I said, "No, well, I won't. There's no water." "No, we've been saving water for 2 days."
Shit.
And the "we" was her and her neighbor, who wasn't a member of the church, but she had gone to her neighbor to say, "This guy who's important in our lives, in our structure, is coming. We've got to let him have a decent wash." So they collectively, I mean, the amount in the end was about 2 inches deep in the bath. But George, I could not get into it. I just thought it's like bizarre. But how much hospitality have you received at that point? You know,
yeah. Well, that's the alabaster jar, isn't it? Pure nard.
Absolutely.
The only thing the only thing of value that she owned. Excuse me.
Yeah.
I want to just quickly, settle this conversation within the scripture and retell the story of the great trees of Mamre, and maybe we can use that as a starting point to talk, or at least a taking off point to talk a little bit further. So I'm going to go back to this picture over here. So there's a story that many who are watching this will well know, a very ancient story which is contained in the book of Genesis chapter 18. And it's a story that happens in the context of the fathers of the Jewish faith, Abraham, Sarah, and they didn't live in houses of bricks and so on. They were almost like a Bedouin. They moved around. They were nomads. They had flocks. They had herds and things, and they used to, take these to good pastures. And Abraham, anyway, was on his way from Mesopotamia, from modern-day Iraq, Iran, Haran, Ur of the Chaldees, and following a destination that he wasn't quite sure, wasn't 100% sure where it was, but God had, in all faithfulness, extended an invitation, and Abraham had accepted it, even though certainty was not part of the deal. But under the so-called great trees of Mamre, they encamped, and it was there that they experienced this. What I read is pretty ordinary in Middle Eastern culture, but what would be very out of the ordinary in Western culture. And that is the 3 strangers, and the text holds nothing back. These are strangers. He doesn't know them. He doesn't recognize them. They're not family of his. They're not of the same, sort of class and culture and everything else. They are others in the big O-T-E-R sense. We don't know them at all. They could be, I mean, if you think about it, in terms of modern parlance, they could be of a different race. They could be immigrants. They could be refugees. They could be the kind of people that you kind of steer clear of because You don't want to get in an awkward situation, you know. And people often have a romantic view of the Bible. They think it was a perfect context, and it wasn't. Paul talks about being robbed on the Roman roads, and
Exactly.
very dangerous. The Good Samaritan story would have no context if it wasn't for the fact that this sort of thing happened. You know, people
Yes.
were beaten up and left in a pool of blood and their stuff stolen. Anyway, uh, let me get to the point. So Abram and Sarah encamped under the great trees of Mamre. They invite three strangers into their home. What is offered is quite simple. Excuse me. What is offered is quite simple, but what is delivered is a little more lavish. They end up slaughtering an animal, cooking the meat. There's cheese that has been made, homemade cheese. There is curds. There's bread that is baked. There is cool water to drink. And of course, I guess the biggest of all things, a lovely shady place to sit and rest before they continue on their journey. The story is interesting because these people are in transit and they're not staying for long. And Abram is keen to communicate that he doesn't want to delay them. And as soon as they've finished and he's offered his hospitality, they're welcome to go. But they enjoy a meal in the company of Abraham and his family and his servants and all of that. And then they leave. But before they leave, they give him a gift, and that's the announcement that Isaac is coming.
Yes.
So this is the interaction that happens under the great trees of Mamre. And when I read about it, when I try to find, parallels in ancient Near Eastern culture, I'm told it was absolutely common for people to behave in this fashion. A good person, a person of dignity, a person who's deserving of respect, was a hospitable person. Now, the fascinating thing about this story is that although it illustrates an ordinary, very ordinary expression of hospitality, when Andrei Rublev, the Russian iconographer, writes about this, he puts it into this picture, this icon, and the icon has changed the strangers into the three persons of the Trinity.
Yes,
which is a huge step. Now, of course, I say it's a huge step, but if you look at the text, you will see that the Hebrew text translated into English uses that big Lord. So the Lord appeared to Abram under the great trees of Mamre. So it's there, and Abram didn't know it, but you and I, the theater audience, in any good play, we know things that the characters don't know. And so we know that it was, in fact, the Lord. And so Rublev also knows that, and he portrays that in this icon. But the icon is open in the front. And there's a little cavity. And the cavity is the traditional space for the bones of the martyrs.
Yes.
And so Rublev is communicating something which Friedrich Buechner called, he always used this phrase, the party is not the same without you. I love that phrase.
That's lovely.
So Abram and Sarah, you may not be sitting at the table, but the party is not the same without you. And whoever is using this icon as a means to prayer, there's a space for you at the table. The circle is incomplete. And so we get called up into the divine life. And that's something that, I think is pretty important when it comes to hospitality, is that we may do something very ordinary, but which is also courageous in our culture, inviting a stranger in. But in the process, something might happen to us that we have not expected. And that something might be mystical. We might be invited into the presence of God himself, into the perichoretic dance. And that's why I called the whole thing, Shall We Dance? Because, that's the ultimate outcome, possibly, if God should choose.
Yeah. You've used the phrase several times, might. We might do this. And I think that's a reserve that's helpful. But I'm a little more conservative or perhaps forthright, I actually think in these moments we are meeting with God, whether we recognize Him or not, whether we're traditional Christians or any faith or not. When that mysticism or mystical moment happens, where you are enjoying the company, whether it's mutual hospitality or not, or one giving and the other receiving, and the outcome is a sense of wonder and amazement, even if it's at the, gee, I'd like the recipe for this, please,
Yes.
Even at that level, or watching the hands of the people who have made food, and I taught my children to look at people's feet and to look at people's shoes and to look at people's hands when they've been served by people, because they tell you all sorts of stories about those very people. That at those moments, I think we're really meeting with the Holy Spirit, and He's making us alive and sensitive to. This is what He wanted. This is the communion of the saints. This is the fellowship of the Spirit that He wanted for the whole world. Mm-hmm. That we would behave like this with one another. So I'm always excited when those things happen, and especially when it's very much a sort of cross-cultural thing, and you're feeling really out of your depth, but there's a sense of magnificence and wonder and joy, and I think God's there. I believe with all my heart. It's not that He might be there. I think He is there.
Wow. So an ordinary act of hospitality may result in something, or you're saying will result. And my only reticence with the will, and it's not really a big reticence, is, you remember, I'm a Presbyterian, and God is sovereign. When He says He's going to do something and He does it, that's His choice. And when He doesn't do it, I'm not looking for Him to do it, because He made a choice not to do it. But I do have in my experience, as you do, that feeling that every time I've been in a real, true, beautiful space of hospitality, something has happened beyond which I can understand. I don't quantify it. I enjoy it. I live it. I long for it, but I don't demand it. And when it comes, it's so unbelievable, and it's simple places.
And again, I think I'm making more of this than I want to, but I understand the kind of reticence, and I accept that that's there. But even in a simple family meal, these moments of the divine presence. So here's a little example. My grandson finishes a meal. We were together a couple of weeks ago. He finishes a meal, very plain. We just had supper, whatever. But he pushes his little plate away and he says, "That was so delicious, Mom." And the word's too big for him to use, but he's got a good vocab. So, and it really was delicious. And she had made it, so it was given to Mom. It was holding tears, because here was the recognition of not just supper was made and served, but the whole experience was delicious, and then attributed to someone else around the table. Beautiful. That's hospitality. It's really fantastic.
It is indeed. There's no doubt about it in my mind. Okay. So another thing I would like to ask is around this word that Henry Nouwen uses. Let me see if I can put it on the screen. This word that Henry Nouwen uses, Dutch word. Gastvryheid. It's a Dutch word, but of course, we who can understand Afrikaans will know that it's the freedom of the guest. Hospitality, therefore, means primarily the creation of a free space where the stranger can enter and become a friend instead of an enemy. And one of the worries I have, deep, deep fears, is that in the process of the hospitality, that it might become, there's a chance that it might become a danger, that it might become me trying to make the person I'm befriending, the person who's my guest, more like me. What do you think of that?
Well, I get a bit gregarious when it comes to serving meals in my own home, and I do out of delight, and I do it out of a real, all before God, but a real desire to serve and to perceive that the guests are Christ in my home. So I want to do really well, but I'm afraid every now and again I go a bit over the top, and I insist on hearing them tell me how good was that. How lovely was that? When I realized palates are just completely different. And what I may have labored over, they may think, well, it's unpalatable, or may have even been inhospitable to serve.
Mm.
So we're now being a bit ridiculous, but I like lamb ribickies.
Yeah.
Well, I would not be hospitable in serving those to my wife, because she cannot take the fat, she cannot take the richness. And no matter how much I labored, I would not be free in her. There would be no gastvryheid towards her by saying, look, my darling, how hard I've worked for you and how
Yes.
expensive this has been. And is this a real treat? Well, I mean, no. So I think that's a tension. I think that really is a tension
Yes.
that we may force others in. But I would rather err by giving it a try than not providing an attempt of gastvryheid, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
But
uh,
maybe it's a corrective that when we find ourselves, doing the things that you've just described, which I've done many times because I love chili and I love curry and things like that. And Sasha and my girls are very reluctant when it comes to that. Leah would eat in curry, but Zoe not. And then I'm just saying, you don't know what you're missing. You don't know what you're
yes,
missing.
exactly.
Or your palate, you must develop your palate. You can't just think, because they say, oh, your taste buds are burnt away. No, 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 hang on. But that's what you're saying is me forcing that on them when it's not their palate. It's not gastvryheid. It's trying to make them like me, trying to have the
And
same.
it sets up a superior inferior relationship.
Yes.
That when you say your palate's not well developed yet. Well, what happens if it's different? I mean, Mandy's going to choose vanilla ice cream 100 times out of 100. You know, if she gets served something else, she may enjoy it, and she may even say that's really nice. But she's not going to order it next time. She'll go to
Yes.
vanilla. Now, I mean, how dare I say? Well, actually, your taste buds are inferior. You know.
Yes.
I yeah. Abraham invited them into his home and
Yes.
into his heart.
Hmm.
Now, this is such a language of intimacy, George.
Hmm.
I must be very gentle here. Um, but rape is not an entry into an act of intimacy.
Hmm.
There's no gastvryheid in that intimacy. It may be intimate, but there's no hospitality whatsoever. However, the whole phrase "come into me, be part of me" is the very one Christ uses about himself.
Hmm.
And it's the language, it's deeply intimate. So
Yes.
how do I let the person come in without the insistence that they be changed to be just like me? I mean, that's the real question. And I don't know, except to try and see and take one's hands off
Hmm.
what you have produced by way of hospitality and let it just be taken and enjoyed.
Yes.
Um, yeah, I'll give you an example of non-hospitality that's
Yes.
that's quite emotional too. My grandfather, Greek, unable to speak very much English, 6 children, is dying. He's 96. He's on his way out, and the family have gathered around his bed. I wasn't there, but my dad tells me this. My dad was the youngest, the spoiled brat of the family,
Hmm.
and Papu says from his bed, "I want an orange. I want an orange."
Hmm.
The oldest son, Peter, picks up an orange that was next to the bed and begins to peel it.
Hmm.
And the old Greek, in the most horrible tone and language, says to him, "You don't know how to peel oranges. Only Jimmy knows how to peel oranges. Give the bloody orange to Jimmy."
You.
And so the spoiled brat of the family peels the orange. For heaven's sake, it's peeling an orange. And the old man takes it and enjoys it.
Hmm.
Now, what is that if not hostility in the extreme form
Yeah.
towards the rest of the family? There's
Hmm.
no intimacy there. There's no joy there. There's no and I think we can do that. We can play those games. That it's got to be on my terms. This is how something's got to be
Yes.
done. Um, No, I don't know. I don't know how to do it.
Mm.
Except by trying to do it. Yeah.
Yes,
Uh,
because of course love requires freedom. Hence Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And love requires freedom. And true love,
yes.
deep love, authentic love requires freedom. And in fact, the New Testament way of describing the most authentic love, agape, is to give it away. It's given
Yes.
away. Nothing is
Yes.
required in return. So really what Noah and others are talking about here in the midst of hospitality is to create a space that's free and given away, where you don't demand anything of your guest. And if
Oh,
your guest doesn't turn out like you, well, then all strength to them. But this was a space in which we were able to find each other, different as we are. Let me ask. I have 100 things that I want to talk about, including the fact that Beatrice Bruto's most beautiful image of that Last Supper, where she says Jesus moves the disciples away from the domination paradigm where there's masters and
yes.
servants to the communion paradigm where he is a friend and he wants to be
Yes.
their friend. And that's not a sort of silly, frivolous thing. No, no, it's a deep,
Yes.
deep choice towards equality, which I think is exactly what we've been talking about. But let me ask you another question because I'm scared we don't get to it. And that is the question, how can we practice, you and I, hospitality in everyday life? What can we do to get to that place where we're able to find another person and a stranger might become a friend? Or, well, and how might we get to that place where it's not that God rewards us, but the natural consequence of our ordinary hospitality is that we get invited into the divine life. The whole
Yes.
Rublev thing. What practical things, what experiences have you had? What stories do you have? What thoughts do you have about ordinary people in everyday life practicing hospitality?
Well, I've made a list of hospitality habits out of my own life and in my family and a bit from the congregation that I served. Um, do they all lead to this moment of a divine presence? I don't know. But I want to say I actually think they are there if we look for them. There's something that really happens. So we used to have a lot of beggars coming to our home. There was no fence around the house, and they knew it was the minister's house, so there was this constant number. And I said to my two daughters that when someone comes and asks for food, they are to receive exactly what we are eating, if we were eating at the time, or exactly what we have just eaten and take it out the fridge and warm it up. And it must be served in the way it was served to you at the table.
Sure.
So you've got to make it look nice. The plating is important, and you do this really nicely. And the number of times the response that from people receiving it is to say praise to hear or God will bless you, sir. Now you could be cynical about that if you want to, but actually I think there are moments where God has recognized what has happened, but God is there in the very midst of it. Now, pause with that. So I'm at the door with someone who is a terrible person, who is going to receive what I'm going to give him, I know, and probably with some thanks, but with no deep gratitude. And I turn, my little daughter's next to me, and I tell her, just go away now. I'm going to see this man, and then I go away to fix the meal in the kitchen. And when I come back to the door, she's come back to the door before me with a teddy bear, one of her favorite teddy bears.
Mm.
And she's handing it to him.
Mm.
And I say, what's going on here? She says, no, he's got a little girl like me who doesn't have a teddy bear. I want this man to have my teddy bear, Daddy.
You.
Well, George, I was so angry. I was immediately angry. And I let the transaction take place, but I don't know how it had happened between the two of them when I wasn't present. that this little interaction that happened and she discovered he had a daughter and whatever. But I thought, you miserable swine, you are stealing something from our child and you have no idea of the value of what she's giving you. But wasn't that a moment of grace beyond measure? That something had happened in this child. Now, again, we could be cynical about it, but I don't want to be. I want to say something of the divine was present. So it comes in the doing of it. I think if you practice generosity, you will discover the numinous. I think that's and at every possible point.
Yeah.
If you wait for the thanks from someone, you've turned the moment of grace into a moment of commerce, and that is straight evil. See, I think it really is evil that we do what the evil one says. If God will bless me, then I will respond appropriately. And I think we simply have to learn to give and to give and to give and to give in all sorts of ways. So I've said before, I try to tell mongrels, look at hands, look at faces, look at feet, and see who you deal with, and be as generous as you possibly can with tips. If you understand the system that people live on tips and don't get a salary or get a minuscule salary and live on tips, then be as generous as you can, even if the service has not always been good, because sure as hell or sure as heaven, I'm going to go before God tomorrow when my service hasn't been good, and I'm going to ask him about it. It also takes thinking through what may seem obvious when I tell you this, but it is not obvious at first. To think through issues. So we arrived at a situation at the congregation of Belleville where, in arranging a funeral, I realized the family did not have the money to pay for this funeral. They simply did not have the liquid cash. I don't know how they were going to get it. We did not have burial societies. We were a white congregation. So I said to them, the church will pay for the funeral. And I hadn't checked it out with the elders yet. And they said, what do you mean? I said, we've got enough in the bank. We'll pay for it. If you ever pay us back, that's okay. But let's just say the funeral's paid for. Now let's get on with grieving and not worry about the finances. And I went back and in an elders meeting said, look, this is what I've done. And what do you think about it? Well, some were not happy at all. But the end result was a policy. So we established a policy that I then declared from the pulpit, knowing that it's possible that some of you may take us for a ride, but we want you to feel safe in your moment of extremity. And so this provision will be there. Well, in the 43 years at the church, only once was it not honored. And it's a terrible story, and I won't tell it, but a terrible story of a father refusing to pay. And said that, whatever. But we thought into the situation and then made it a lifestyle policy. And I think that those are things that we need to do all the time at whatever level. If it's a simple policy of tip in well or be as generous as one can in other ways. Yeah.
So in the books that I've read on hospitality, one of them by a woman called Christine Pohl, she cautions. She says that hospitality, firstly comes at a cost because, we've got to get over ourselves and it can be dangerous. And she also says we don't have all the money in the world. We want to be hospitable to everybody, but we don't have the capacity to do so. So there's all these, how can I say, all these ring fences or these restrictions that we come up against whenever we exercise hospitality. And that's something I think that we have to grieve at points. We want to do something, but we can't. And we can only do what we can do. But it's not that we put limits on ourselves. It's that we have practical limits. And I'm sure you come across, things like that.
One of the things I had to constantly reteach the pastoral group at the Belleville Church was capacity. There are issues around capacity. You cannot do everything, and it is okay to say no at some stages. But every time I say that, ringing loudly in my ear is, if you want to lose your life, save it.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to discover life, lose it. So there's a tension deep within me. But yes, I think there are real issues around capacity. Ian Thompson taught me, Rod, if you have nothing to give, it's okay to give nothing.
Mm.
But in that moment, you will be giving yourself to these people.
Wow. Yes.
Now, that's mind-blowing, George, that actually I should be free because I have nothing to give at this moment. That does not mean I absent myself from that interaction, but
Yes.
I'm present.
Give yourself. Wow.
And their actions in that moment of touching a person or shaking their hand or looking at their eyes or smiling or noticing something about them and saying, gosh, how did you get that scar on your arm? And that's hospitality.
Mm.
And God's present at that moment. And nothing has changed hands.
Powerful. Eh? Wow. Oh, well, I think we probably need to draw things to a close because our time is out. I've got one last story, but is there anything else you would want to share, Ron?
There's so much. There's just so much. But in your paper, in the notes, you mentioned the Genesis 18 passage, and that what Sarah and Abraham had in front of them were strangers who were unknown and unrelated. And I thought that those are very powerful words, and that's the essence of the growing edge of hospitality. Can I show hospitality to sorry, I've got a cold, to strangers or to people who are unknown or to unrelated? So me in the bathwater was a perfect example.
Mm-hmm.
These people did not know me at all. They may have known the title in the church, but they did not know me whatsoever.
Yes.
And certainly the neighbors didn't. Mm-hmm. And no relationship whatsoever of kith and kin, you know. Yeah. And given the difficulties in South African society of white and black, boy, I'm a stranger at every point. But they practiced hospitality. Mm-hmm. At what cost, I don't know. So it becomes for me that those are the grain edges. Mm-hmm. To if I can learn hospitality, both to give and to receive it within my family, within my congregation, within my home group, within my friendships. You know, paying for a coffee with a friend is pretty easy, but it is hospitality. But if I've got to learn to extend that and be on that growing edge, where are the strangers, where are the unknowns, you know, where are the unrelateds? I think we're well on the way to where the Spirit wanted the church to go.
Right. Well, I thought the last story that I would tell is, and I think I've told it to you before, but some years ago, I think it was 2015, I had a privilege, an opportunity to work with a colleague in the United States, in Atlanta, looking at new worshiping communities. It was my great interest at that time, but still to a certain extent is. And she set up a whole lot of, I think it was over 4 weeks or something in Atlanta, and she set up a lot of appointments, you know, to go and visit churches, new worshiping communities, and many of them were pretty much like the kind of church you and I would be used to on an ongoing basis. But this one particular day, the appointment was set up with a particular group of people, and we met at a laundry, a coin-operated laundry in town. And that surprised me, but she didn't really want to describe what was going to happen. She said I should just go with the flow and experience this. And so I turned up there a little bit anonymously. But when I went into the laundry, I discovered that there were members of this group already there. And I was enlisted to launder clothes, you know, in a coin-operated washing machine. And afterwards, We put them in the dryer, and then afterwards we, shook out and folded them and so on. And through most of the process, I thought to myself, what the heck am I doing here? What is the point of this? This is a practical task. I've done it at home 1,000 times, and when I've been traveling, like in Atlanta, I've done it, even there. What on earth is this all about? But as the process continued, I think in the drying phase, they started to explain what their ministry was. They took clothing, or they were given clothing by homeless people. And they explained that in itself was a complicated process, because a homeless person will not part with their personal possession. They have so little. And so they're so terrified that their things might be stolen. And they often are stolen by others. They're at risk all the time. So for them to relinquish a load of washing or even an outfit is virtually impossible.
Absolutely.
So you have to you kind of have to gain trust. And once you gain trust, they entrust it to you. And then this group was using this as a spiritual practice of hospitality to pray for the person who wore those clothes. So as they put the clothes into the washer, they would pray for the person. If they knew their name, which sometimes they did, excuse me, they would mention the name.
Beautiful.
Excuse me.
Beautiful.
And as they explained it to me, and as I took part in the exercise, I think it was when I was folding, there was just tears and tears coming out of me. To think, Lord, who is this person who owns these clothes?
Yeah.
What put them on the street? Did they get depressed? Did they lose their job? Did they get addicted to alcohol or drugs? Or what happened in their lives to put them on the streets? And are they in danger on a daily basis? Are they safe?
Yes.
So much. Is there any connection between me and this person? I mean, I don't know who the person is, and I don't have to know, but you can tell me, So it became a spiritual practice for me doing that load of laundry, washing it, drying it, folding it, putting it into the laundry bag, and sending it back with these people to the church, where the next day it would be picked up. And this is a weekly thing that they do. And this group is just as closely connected and bonded as they would have been if they were involved in any other thing, perhaps even more so, because they do this every week as their spiritual practice, and it draws them close to God.
It's a beautiful story. You said in your paper, you refer to the ancient Byzantine practice, gazing. And literally, as I listen to you, that comes to mind. What you were doing is gazing beyond the clothes to the person behind them.
Yes.
And God moves you to tears because you suddenly see sheep without a shepherd who are utterly vulnerable to the point of needing clothes washed and having to trust someone else to do it. So that's a beautiful act of hospitality. Just quickly, do you remember the story of Tony Campolo providing a birthday party for a prostitute?
Yes, but tell it anyway, because it's a great story.
I'm not sure I'm going to get it right, but certainly at some point he wanted to have some sort of ministry to prostitutes in the area, and realized that they mostly came to a diner in the early hours of the morning.
Yes.
And he discovers one of them is going to have a birthday in the next week or so. And he organizes cake and candles and balloons. And when they arrive at 2 or 3 in the morning, he has this all ready. And they want to know what's going on. And he says, it's for you. It's your birthday.
Yes.
And her response is, I want to come to church to meet this God who throws a birthday party for a whore.
It is a powerful, powerful story. Yeah. And apparently she was so she wouldn't let anyone eat the cake. She'd never had a cake.
Yeah.
Or at least it's been many years since she had. And the one I heard was the person in charge of the diner, the manager or whatever, said, He says a prayer. Tony says a prayer. And in the prayer, he doesn't say anything about judgment. He thanks the Lord for this woman and for the fact that it's her birthday, and he asks God to bless her. Yeah. And the guy says to him, you didn't tell me you're a pastor. And he says, I'm not a pastor, I'm just a Christian. Yeah. And he said, well, if there was a church like this, he would come.
Yes, that's like it. But, George, just one last thought. What your article did for me was send me back to Romans chapter 5, that we have peace with God through the grace in which we stand. We have peace with God. And I've put in brackets in my Bible there, we have hospitality with God.
Oh yes. Heavenly banquet. The party won't be the same without us. Thank you so much for your time, Rod.
It's been lovely. Always lovely, George.
It's been almost an hour now of conversation, and I think people might enjoy watching this. Hospitality is accessible. It's not fancy. It's not technical. It's just ordinary. It's generosity, it's kindness, all wrapped up into one. So I really hope that as a result of this, that people will give it a try.
You've got a lovely gift to facilitate this, George. Really.
Great. Thanks, Rod.
Bye.